Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here for this bar-hosted event in collaboration with UN Women. The topic to be discussed this evening is closing the gender gap pensions, and it's going to be presented by Ms. Isiuwa Iyahen. And my name is Dale Ford. I am the communications consultant with BAR. Just some housekeeping matters before we get started. We just want you to mute your microphone. We will have a answer and questions segment, and we welcome your questions, your comments, your suggestions, your feedback, and that will come after the presentation. This presentation is going to be posted on YouTube, so if you missed anything or you do want to share it with your colleagues or your family and friends, you can do so through the YouTube link, and that should be posted within the next maybe 48 to 72 hours after today. I do want to introduce our president, Ms. Marilyn Rice-Bowen, who is going to give us some welcome remarks. Good evening, President Marilyn.
Good evening to all. You hear me all right? Are you hearing me
Yes,
okay?
I am hearing you. I'm hearing you well.
Okay, fine. Deputy Representative and Head of Office and Interim for the UN Women Multi-Country Office for the Caribbean, Isiuwa. Directors of the BARC Board, members and staff of BARC, friends of BARC, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session this evening. As we focus, as we all recognize that women are all aware of the inequality which currently exists in pensions. We know that even with the strides that we have made in our careers and in our workplaces, that there are some areas that men were still being paid more than women, which means that at retirement, men were receiving more income, will receive more income than women. And with the rising cost of living, the cost of food and healthcare, women are therefore forced to adjust their budgets to make their fixed income stretch. And note that I said fixed income because it is indeed a fixed income. This is it. We do look forward this evening to Ms. Iyahen's presentation, which will, of course, break down this phenomenon and outline how the disparity can be remedied. I encourage you to listen intently, make notes, and as some of us would have already been retired, some of the information shared might be too late for us, but it's not too late for our family members, and because we are all centers of influence, that we can share nuggets of information that we gather today so that those persons who are coming behind us, they'll be less fearful. So make your notes, and during the Q&A, ask all the questions that you want to ask. I welcome you all this evening to this session.
Thank you so much, Madam President. I just want to talk a little bit about Ms. Iyahen. She's currently the Deputy Representative and the Head of the Office for the UN Women Multi-Country Office, as our President said, and that's for the Caribbean. She is responsible for the day-to-day management of the MCO, substantially contributing to the design, implementation, management, and oversight of programs and operations to ensure effective and efficient delivery of results. Prior to assuming the position of Deputy Representative, Ms. Iyahen managed the economic empowerment and statistics portfolios for the UN Women MCO Caribbean. In that capacity, her technical leadership resulted in narrowing significant knowledge, research, and gender data gaps on violence against women and girls, the labor force, social protection, and unpaid care work in CARICOM. She has over 70 years of experience in international development, and she's served in various capacities within the United Nations system and non-governmental organizations. She has a Master of Public Policy degree from the University of Minnesota's Hubert Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science from Swarthmore College. We say good evening and welcome to Ms. Iyahen to make her presentation.
Thank you so much, Madam President, Marilyn Rice Bowen, to Ms. Dale Ford, to all the members of BARP, all other representatives of government, civil society that are here present. I really do appreciate the opportunity that has been afforded UN Women to be able to join with you here today, albeit virtually. I wish I really could have been there in person, but it didn't happen. We have to make it happen sometime in the future, and I really do hope that we have a fulfilling and rich discussion here today. So I guess I can go ahead and start the presentation. Just give me 1 second. To be able to do that, and then we can go ahead. So just bear with me. Okay, please do let me know if you're seeing my screen.
Yes, I can see it.
Excellent. Okay, so when I was invited to make the presentation, and it was a very flexible set of options provided, that I could propose what topic, and I thought this would be an opportunity time to really discuss pensions. And given the focus of BARP and the areas of priority that I thought would be most interesting to the membership, I thought this would be um, an area of discussion that I think would be most relevant. But let me also share with you, for those of you who don't know UN Women very well, it's the UN entity for gender equality and the empowerment of women. We are the UN agency that has lead responsibility on issues regarding gender equality and women's empowerment. In the Caribbean, we focus on the following areas you see on the screen. We work to strengthen gender norms and what we call the normative framework, the treaties and obligations that the country has signed on to. And we do that through strengthening data collection and use so that there's data to be able to monitor and measure progress on those conventions. And also, we can use this data to address harmful gender norms. And also, in this area of work, we also support women's leadership, women's political um, rights, and so on. We also focus on economic empowerment and resilience. And in that area of work, we pay particular attention to shock responsive social protection and ensuring that throughout the life course for women and men, that they're able to access the necessary programs, that their policies are crafted in such a way that protect them from income insecurity from the beginning of life to the end of life. And that's essentially what social protection is. So as UN Women, what we do is we work with government partners to be able to strengthen the policy and service delivery framework around social protection, which would include, although we work less on pensions, but a pension system is part of a social protection system. In our economic empowerment portfolio, we also focus on innovative financing and access to capital for women MSMEs, also gender lens investing, which essentially means that we work with financial institutions to be able to incorporate a gender lens in the lending products that they offer. We also work on as I said, women MSMEs, but also gender responsive budgeting as well. We also work on ending violence against women and girls. Historically, this has been our largest area of work, and on climate change and the disaster risk resilience. So if we go straight into the topic of discussion at hand. When I was preparing this presentation, I said, okay, you know, prior to assuming my position, I led and I still lead actually, I have technical leadership in the office on social protection issues. But to be quite honest, we don't do as much work on towards the end of life spectrum, the pensions and so on. We focus more on the social protection issues for women active in the labor market and in there. And I don't like to use this word, they're productive years. Now, but then I recalled in the annals of history in the office that we had an expert who had analyzed some data from the Barbados Survey of Living Conditions, which is the survey that's done to measure poverty in the country. It's called the Survey of Living Conditions. Now, this data is dated 2016 to 2017. Usually, these surveys are done every 10 years. So, it's my understanding that there are discussions around doing another one quite soon. In any case, I do remember that the expert, her name is Debbie Budlender, that she had looked through the data and had pulled out information on income issues related to persons who are 60 plus years. And that's what I'm sharing with you now. When you look at the pension, government pension, not that much of a difference. We have 12% of men in that category relying on the government pension fund income and 11%. So there's not that much of a gender difference there. When you look at pension for local employment, there's a 3% difference. Foreign employment, so for people who would have been employed overseas, there's a 5% differential with men at 9% and 4% for women. The NIS relying on contributory pensions, which means throughout their working years, they would have contributed through their salary contributions to the NIS. And we see a 4% differential there with men, 39% relying on the NIS, the contributory pension for their income, and 35% for women. Then when we look at the non-contributory pension, which is people who, for whatever reason, did not have a pension, they did not contribute, but the NIS is providing them with this assistance, which I have to point out, I'm sure many of you already know this, that this is kind of unique in the Caribbean. The Barbados is one of the few countries that actually has a non-contributory NIS or social security, as they would call it, pension system. You would find that people who ended up in this situation would be they would be shifted to the public assistance program. And I think in Barbados, there's also a public assistance program, or it's called the welfare program. That's where they would be shifted to. So, but if you look at that, you will see that 12% of women rely on the NIS non-contributory pension and men at 6%. So over 50% more of women in that category rely on non-contributory pension, which indicates to me that they're in a vulnerable situation from an income security standpoint. And that's a difficult place to be regardless in one's life, but definitely towards in the golden years, one would think that you're not, in such a precarious situation. So why are we seeing this? Over women's life courses, we know that they're characterized by a number of things, and this is global. It's not just Barbados. Taking care of others. So in Barbados, women carry the main responsibility for unpaid domestic and care work. And notably, Barbadian women spend statistically significant more time, close to 2 hours or more, on unpaid domestic and care work compared to men, and nearly 2.5 times more for unpaid childcare than men, contributing to the most significant gap among these measures. So out of all the types of unpaid care work measured is childcare, but also care for, cleaning, cooking, and so on. Now, this is in line with the global average. As I said, this is not unique to Barbados, and I will share the report, the source data in the chat, so that you can have a look at that report. this is the first time that Barbados has produced this type of data. Now, we also know that women's life courses are characterized by lower labor market participation, probably because they step out of the workforce when to have children, or it may be that due to some kind of discrimination in the labor market, they participate at lower rates than men, or even in the case of CARICOM, where women, for those who achieve tertiary education, so they are even more highly educated than men, they still experience unemployment at higher rates. And then globally, women do more part-time work, which is not protected labor, what the labor economists will call protected labor. Usually you find that a full-time job will come with Social Security, or NIS, as we call it, these protections that many of us take for granted. But if you're doing more part-time work, usually that type of employment does not come with the protection of a pension. And so you may find that some of those people I showed that are represented in this slide here, who the NIS non-contributory pension, it may not be that they were not working. It may be, we don't know, we don't have the evidence to corroborate this right now, but it would have been interesting to go back to those people to say, why did you not have a pension? Is it because you're doing part-time work? Is it because you're unemployed? Is it like, who knows? And then, as I mentioned earlier, even in situations like in many Caribbean countries where they are even more highly educated than men, they earn less. So all these features compromise pension entitlements in pension systems that link benefits to paid work, contributions, and earnings. So even in situations where you have a pension, if you earn less than your male counterparts, then you're going to get a lower investment you would have been contributing less to your pension, and so on. So you see, the things that happen to women over their life course have implications. They have implications toward the end of life. Now, I delved more, did some more desktop research into this pension entitlement issue, and women experience lower labor market participation rates than men. So they're working part-time, they're working around the world as spouses, as daughters, sisters, mothers, and provide most of the care for children, the sick, disabled, elderly relatives. So this compromises their labor market earnings and employment-related benefits, including future pensions. Most of this work that is unpaid is often done with love and care, but without the security of, the income security protections that paid labor would provide. Now, as I said earlier, women have lower average earnings than men because they work part-time, or they tend to work more part-time. And when you look at point number 3, where women tend to live longer than men. Again, globally, this is the case. They live longer. As a result, they require greater lifetime transfers to finance a longer period of retirement. And when these longer periods of pension receipt are taken into consideration in the calculation of the benefit, women get lower monthly pension benefits than men, independent of their labor market and contribution patterns. Now, I wish I had Barbados specific data to corroborate all of this and to prove to you that this is not just a global thing, this is also a Barbadian thing. But I don't have access to that information. But I'm willing to bet that if I did, you will see these same patterns, given what we see in the Barbados Continuous Labor Force Statistics, which is produced by the Barbados Statistical Department. You will see that women tend to earn less and are unemployed at higher rates. Even if where there might be, because they do that survey every quarter, even in situations where you may see that is not all the case for all the 4 quarters, but generally speaking, over a period of a year, 2 years, 3 years, you see that trend in Barbados. So then you can assume that if that is the case and they're earning less, then that's less money available for investing in a pension. Now, given longer life expectancy of women and the fact that women tend to marry men a few years older than themselves and are more likely to, therefore they're more likely to become widows. There is the protection of a widow's benefit in Barbados, right? Many countries around the world that is in question, particularly for lower income, least developed economies and so on. But women who lack a retirement pension of their own can be particularly vulnerable in old age if they are not entitled to a widow's pension, or if their husband, if they didn't work and then they were relying on their husband's pension if the husband passed on, and then they kind of were surprised and shocked that maybe he didn't contribute to a pension, or they didn't know what he was doing, or something like that. So that is kind of a precarious situation to be in. And then, and if there are no non-contributory pensions, so at least in Barbados, where you're in that kind of a situation, you can rely on a non-contributory pension, as small as it may be, but at least it exists. In many jurisdictions, that doesn't exist. As I said, even in the Caribbean, then you have to go on to the welfare program. Widowhood can bring economic hardship and vulnerability as well for women. So yeah, so that is an issue of concern. So then, what do we do about this? The priorities for action is we have to provide basic protection for all older adults, regardless of individual contributory records and past paid work and earnings. And I know this is controversial for some because I've had long-standing discussions with some people about this in other Caribbean countries, not like Barbados, that at least has that non-contributory pension. And the argument is no. This is social security, as many of them call it, should be for people who contributed to a pension. None of this non-contributory thing like what Barbados has. Let them go to the public assistance program. You know, here in Barbados, that's not the issue, but the issue therefore is the non-contributory pension enough, right? Obviously it would not be, because these are people that did not contribute during their working years, even though they're part of the NIS beneficiary system. But the recommendation is that at least to provide this basic protection, which Barbados does, at least it exists, the adequacy of it, we can have, if we had data to analyze the adequacy of it, well, that's a different discussion. So the recommendation also is to include progressive benefit top-ups for workers with limited benefit entitlements. For example, the part-time workers and people who work, but their benefits are limited because of the type of employment that they're in. If they were in more precarious employment, I remember an example, very sad case from St. Lucia, not from Barbados, where there was a domestic worker who worked all her years working as a domestic, and she thought her employer was contributing to Social Security. And when she retired, she thought she could rely on this pension, only to discover that the employer didn't do that. So she was shifted to the public assistance program. I ended up in a very precarious situation in old age. So, that kind of is an issue for the courts, in my opinion. But I am sure there are other people in that situation in Barbados where they may not even know, or they may have been working as a domestic worker, or in situations where they may not know their rights. They may not know or they have this blind trust in their employer, and they are working in occupations where they are vulnerable. Their literacy rates may be lower. They may not have the kind of capacity to interrogate, or whether the employer was actually making that contribution. And so there are cases like this where we also have to, to look at the judicial system and to find ways of protecting some workers, and to pursue such employers that are unscrupulous. Now, the second recommendation is to avoid punishing short or interrupted labor market histories where you stepped out of the labor market for whatever reason, whether it's maternity to take care of sick relatives, or you have an interrupted, you're working as a waitress and as a gas station attendant, and your work history is interrupted for whatever reason, and to design the benefit formulas in a way that doesn't punish time out of work. Now here in Barbados, we see that we not only have maternity leave, we have paternity leave for 3 months, I think. Is it 3 months or I stand corrected? I know for women, it was pushed up to the ILO recommended standard, which I think is a little over, it's 14 weeks. And for men, I have to go back and correct myself. I don't think it's 3 months. I think it's more like a month. So at least, and this is important and has implications for this recommendation, in the sense that there's something called a motherhood penalty. This is a global, what the feminist economists or labor market economists who call the motherhood penalty, where you step out of the paid work, your paid work history becomes inconsistent, or you do more part-time work, and then you kind of pay the price, right? Later on. From an income standpoint. Now, if you distribute the penalty, where the quote unquote penalty is not only on women, but also on men, then it's not, both men and women will be required to step out of the labor force to take care of children, their infants. So it's no longer a penalty on women, if you see what I mean. The sanction, and again, for lack of a better word, I don't like to use that word, is then shared. Employers will not have kind of a reason to prioritize what type of worker they want to keep in the workforce. So these are the kinds of things that have implications for retirement, because the interrupted work history becomes less interrupted if both men and women have to be out of the labor force to take care of children. That's just one example. And that the duration is the same. In the case of Barbados, it's not the same. I think Barbados, it's 1 month paternity leave. But when we get to a point where it is equal, then that motherhood penalty becomes less of a penalty. It may be a parenthood penalty, but then I don't think there's any economist that would agree that you should not employ parents, right? Because they're parents. So that the penalty is dissipates, and it's no longer a penalty because it's kind of shared equitably. So we also have to think about those issues. The other priority or recommended priority for action is to compensate for time dedicated to unpaid care work and care, which is what I just mentioned about the parental leave, but also for the elderly and for sick members of the family. In Barbados, the innovation in what was just proposed for men and women is that you can transfer your maternity or parental leave to the grandparents, which I think is great. Where if you for whatever reason you may have, if your company is granting you 6 months off, you can grant some of that to a grandparent who wants to help, and they get the benefit as well. So these are things to consider. Also, these measures can protect pension rights after women are divorced or widowed, and compensate for the costs that the distribution of unpaid care work in family arrangements can have on pension entitlements, right? The other recommendation is to pool longevity risk broadly. So promote pension schemes that pool the risk for longevity between women and men, and avoid punishing those who live longer. So this also involves indexing mechanisms for pension benefits to avoid the loss of purchasing power with age, which makes women suffer more due to longevity. This indexing is a mechanism that adjusts the pension benefits to reflect changes in the cost of living or wages, ensuring that they maintain their purchasing power over time. If this is a fixed income and you retire and you got $100 in 10 years ago, and it's still $100 now, but the cost of living has gone up, the recommendation is that you index that to adjust the pension benefits to reflect these changes in cost of living. And this has particular implications for women because they live longer. And so you don't want them to suffer for longer periods at that stage of their life when, and I know this will come as a cost to the government and companies and so on, but then what you then account for an increase in the cost of living, and you insulate these seniors from income insecurity when they get to that stage of life. So policies fundamental for the well-being of elderly women can also benefit men. This is not a zero-sum game. We've been talking about women because women here, because of the gender roles that they play, the care work and so on over the course of their years. So we're speaking more of this precarity because of gender roles and gender norms. But this is a whole of society thing. If one group their standard of living goes up, they have more income at their disposal to invest in the economy, that's good for the entire economy, including for men and for children and everyone. So non-contributory pensions, for instance, are as important for informal workers. We talked about the non-contributory pension in the context of people like the examples I shared who did not contribute, but we are not only referring to women. This is also for men who are informal workers, who work part-time, who are low income, who for whatever reason did not invest in a pension. We are giving women a pension of their own, which is essential for the contribution to their household budget, but this also benefits men within that same household. Non-contributory pensions can provide predictable and regular transfers, even if sometimes not sufficient to afford a living. It is still a contribution. It's better than nothing. So these are just some thoughts I wanted to share with you. I really do look forward to the conversation. Again, I'm not a pension specialist, but I thought given the information that UN Women had, particularly from that analysis of the survey of living conditions and the work that I do on social protection, that I thought this would be a useful conversation to have in this context. So thank you so much again, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. It's a lot of information to take in, some very good information as well. You were able to clarify some of the areas that I'm sure those who were on the call probably were not clear on. One of the first things I want to ask, so, it's interesting the disparity, and we kind of, I guess, as females have a bias leaning towards women, but of course, men are heavily affected as well. And it was interesting, the story you told about the woman who was working and expected that on retirement that she would have gotten her benefits, and she didn't. So for those, you did say that, it is important to be able to do that. But as you also noted, some people may not have the capacity or may even feel a little intimidated. So, what would you suggest could happen, especially from our end at BARP? Do you think that this is something that we should intervene on behalf of our members? Or how do you think is the best way to go about something like that?
So I think the first thing is to involve or do some legal literacy. There are occupations of workers that I would think, and even the labor unions could assist BARP with this, that are more vulnerable. You mentioned they may be intimidated. There's a power differential between them and the employer. For example, a domestic worker, right? People who may not have the confidence to be able to say, did you pay my NIS, right? To be able to read their pay slips. And so I think this is where BARP, perhaps in collaboration with the unions that represent such workers, can engage in some kind of advocacy in, encouraging people to be more vigilant about what their employers are doing, right? But I also think, and this is the more tricky part, but I believe in legal sanctions when people infringe on rights like that. That is a violation of rights. And I think that kind of employer should be sued. Now, practically speaking, we are not a judicial litigious society. But this is where representation in unions of those types of workers then becomes important. Barb can, of course, advocate for this. I mentioned domestic workers, but there are many other categories of workers that would probably fit into that kind of a situation where and the question may be, well, this is why is it an issue for Barb? Well, you may be 35 working as a domestic worker, and when you're 65 and this happens to you, you're in trouble. That vigilance has to happen when you're much younger, right? And so I think this is an opportunity for Barb to partner with unions. The legal issues, where I don't know what the status is of I think there's a legal aid program in Barbados. I do think that this is where maybe that could be natural allies in situations like this, where for people who may not be able to afford a lawyer, that organization could perhaps clarify to BARP and the unions what services they can offer in situations like that. So that if you end up 70 years old, 65, you discover that you don't have any retirement, then you can approach a lawyer, right? Who can then advocate on your behalf and perhaps sue that employer, recognizing that our cultural context, people don't like to. And then the case takes forever in the court, and before you know it, will you even be alive to see the benefits of the judgment? But I do think that we cannot allow such employers to get away with violations like that. But that's my perspective.
Okay, the president has her hand raised. Madam President, you have a question or comment?
Yes, thank you. A comment too as well. Thank you, Isiuwa. You always deliver, and you always stir that. You know, you've deposited so much information, but I could see where we at BARC could dig deeper in the form of advocacy. Because as I was listening to you, I reflect on woman the housewife. Because that woman, the housewife, I wore another hat before. So I was able to influence some women how to, the correct word is to plan for yourself. So even if you take out $100 out the house money, put it one side for yourself. Because and I have been able now at BARC to hear stories where women come and they say, look, I've been a housewife all my life, but then when the husband comes home, he comes home now on a reduced pension, on a reduced income. But yet you're now supposed to run the house as if you were getting the full income. So, they are put under severe pressure. So, of course, I show women how to do it. And I think we need to start that conversation with women and men too as well, because we could have this conversation with our BARC members, because maybe if men are aware of the situation that their partners, their loved ones find themselves in later in life, when they can't even go and have an additional job, they might think differently. And I want to end with woman, the caregiver. Woman, the caregiver she does not even have health insurance, and certainly no pension. So you have situations, because whenever a decision has to be made with reference to caregiving, is the woman who has to stay home. So she gives up her job and she comes home, and then at the end of it all, there's no pension for her. But what I've been able in my time when I was wearing another hat, I would always encourage women who are working as domestics. I would communicate with their bosses and tell them, look, set aside something for her. In addition to NIS, set aside a little something so that when she gets down the road, that you can give her something in addition to the rocking chair. So I'll end there, but I realize that there's a lot of work to be done. And I know that we have the foot soldiers at BARC.
Yes, thank you, Madam President. Of course,
Thanks for stimulating the interest.
Yes, and thank you for your comments and suggestions. And of course, this presentation is going to be uploaded to our YouTube, and we will be sharing it with our members, and of course in our newsletter, which is going to be coming out in early April, so we can get some more input and some more feedback on what Ms. Iyahen has presented for us today. I want to go back to you though, because I want to ask, I know you touched on it a little bit, but I just wanted you to expand. Are there any stark differences on how men are affected compared to women? I think we have a pretty good grasp of how it affects women, but do you find any glaring differences on how this situation affects men when they find themselves in similar situations? And are there any particular nuances we need to pay attention to?
You mean in terms of the pension?
In terms of the pension and the fact that they don't have access to a pension, because we know women, they may have children who may look after them. We find that some men find themselves maybe a little bit more isolated. They don't have the support that women would usually tend to have. So I'm just trying to find out if you find there are any stark differences on how this whole situation affects men.
So one of the slides, if you don't mind, I'll just share it again. This is the
Yes, for
geek in me.
sure.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay, because I know
I'm a
you touched
nerd.
on it, as I said, but I just wanted us to delve into it a little deeper.
So this slide gives some indication of what is happening with men. Not as much as I would like, but if you look at the non-contributory pension, right? So you're seeing my screen?
Yes, I'm seeing your
Yes.
screen, very clear.
So the very bottom there, the NIS non-contributory, which is really, when I see that, I see people who didn't contribute who now end up getting, and I'm sorry, I don't know how much it is off the top of my head. Maybe somebody on the call knows how much they will get something, but it's obviously not going to be as much as those who got a contributory pension. Now, what you see there is that of those people who are on a non-contributory pension, which I'm guessing they're either poor or low income, or they had kind of, work histories where they did not contribute to their pension, or they could have been negligent. I think there's someone who had the money and then maybe they didn't invest or whatever. But I'm willing to guess that those people in that category are in that vulnerable income category, which includes men, right? So that's 6% of them, 60 plus or older, who then have to, in their golden years, their retirement years, have to end up on NIS non-contributory pension, but women are almost double that number. Now, so that delves into the gives some insight that men definitely are affected, right? But they are affected based on that data at lesser rates than women. But your point is well noted in terms of we do have data from what happens to, there are a lot of older men living alone, right? That don't have the social capital that some women may have had or have because they were the carers. And so when a disaster strikes, people will go and take care of the people who took care of them. And they find after disasters that not, I don't know if it's the case in Barbados, but I'm willing to guess it's the same, but in some other Caribbean countries, that you have these older men living alone in precarious situations by themselves, whereas the women had that network, right? The family network, somebody to help them out. Now, what does this have to do with pensions? We've seen that in the public assistance programs in some Eastern Caribbean countries I've worked with, we do find that phenomenon. Older men living alone who end up on public assistance, right? And I do think that then you have to look at the life course. What happened that they are in this situation, right? By themselves, living alone, without the kind of family cohesive network that we would assume women have. Now, I don't know if I'm even answering your question, but just to say that there are those gender differences that you see in the latter part of life, but that's very much linked to the kind of weakness or strength of the familial connection that the men would have had, right? And I hate to bring this up in this context, but this may be related to, a man having different families with different women. And then when they get older, they buy themselves. There may be there's that phenomenon. But for both women and men, what we are seeing with the population pyramid is we are having, regardless of sex, less children. There are a lot of us living alone, women included, right? And so this is something we also have to take into consideration. But to answer your question, I do think that I wouldn't be surprised if you have a lot of older men living alone, relying on that NIS, particularly the non-contributory pension, because they have no other option. That's it. That's it. You know, um, and that's obviously of concern. We want no one to be in that situation, but even in that category, you will see that with 6% of men and 12% for women. So what I would recommend is if there's a particular concern about this, and there should be, there needs to be like a gender analysis of the NIS data to see who is living in that situation, but also on the welfare program, right? Like seniors on the welfare program in Barbados, how many are men? How many are women? And that may answer your question there, right? And then there are some who may not even decide to go and even go to the NIS. They have no income, but they have to get income from somewhere to go to the grocery store and to eat. They must get something from somewhere. So I think we need more analysis of the NIS data, of the welfare data, to do a gender like analysis and age analysis to see what's happening to that group, 60 and above or retired and above on a fixed income. Who are they? Where are they? What is their income status? And this is why I'm hoping that Barbados does that next survey of living conditions, because it will be good to compare that 2016-17 data to the data now, right? To see if you still have those people, the 6% of beneficiaries that are men and 12% that are women who are poor or likely poor. That's my guess. And the precarity of their living circumstances. Yes.
I know this may be outside of the scope of your research, but there's been a lot of concern about the paying back into the NAS and the viability of the fund, and even its availability for what would be our 40-year-old members when they become 65 in another maybe 25 years or so. Because as we know, it's expected that half of the population of Barbados is projected to be 65 years and older. So how does that tie into your research? And then after that, I want you to kind of expand on how would your research inform policies and decisions or suggestions on how we would deal with things like that?
So I think President Marilyn gave a big insight into how we can address some of those situations. If you wait till the end of life to have these concerns, to be depending on the NIS anywhere in the world, it's not only Barbados, then you are in serious trouble. I think Marilyn used this word, but basically we have to be investment minded. And this has to happen from the time we start working. And many people, when they're in their 30s and 40s, they're not thinking about when they're 60, but they really should be. Because many of these pension schemes, to be quite honest, anywhere in the world, will never be able to give you can't rely on that alone. Let's just put it that way. You can't rely on that alone because of the aging population, the demographic crisis that's going to happen. Government simply will not be able to have the fiscal space unless you are a very rich country to be able to provide every single person with a living wage based on a social security benefit or an NIS. So that means that throughout your life, Marilyn said you put some money aside, you have to look at other options, right? Other investment opportunities, whether it's investing in real estate or getting another pension scheme outside of the NIS. The challenge with that, though, is not everybody can do that. And for those who are not me and you, right, who have, highly educated and are employed, there are some who, like the domestic worker, right? Who is underemployed, who may not have the capacity, may not even be thinking about that. And then there are those who will not have any income at all, who never worked, who are living with a disability, you know. So I think that is where those of us who are in a better off situation, it's incumbent upon ourselves to go and take care of yourself. Of course, you have the right to a pension, so that for the least among us who don't have any income or who are, living in precarious situations, perhaps then the focus would then be on ensuring that there is a top up, for those populations, right? And now I think, I'm sorry, I lost track of your second question. You asked me another question. The research, right? So
Yeah.
then what are the research
Yeah,
priorities and how will this?
so based on the
Yes.
research and even, the possibility of these things happening, that there will not be enough money, how does that
Yeah.
kind of inform, how does your research kind of inform how you move forward, how a government move forward, how does the country move forward to deal with these kinds of situations?
So I think this is where poverty policy becomes, you have to have an age sensitive policy, poverty policy. I think Barbados, another country, should have poverty reduction strategies that take into account aging and gender and aging, and look at the data to really ensure that the kind of programs like an NIS, but others, not just NIS, really are tailored with the population pyramid and the demographic crisis in mind, right? So from the very beginning, in the design of that policy, you have to understand that you may have people who are 60 and over who may rely on the NIS, but they can't only be relying only on the NIS. The poverty strategy then has to link them up with other services that would defray the cost of living. For example, Marilyn mentioned health. Barbados has a universal health system. As much as we complain about it, we have a universal health system. Many places we don't have that. It needs to be preserved. And so this is where the advocacy of BARP becomes important, that if we want people to live in dignity, including at the end of their life, you must have a publicly funded healthcare system that is responsive to the needs of, older people as well. I also think uh, of course, I'm going to put in a policy for gender policy, gender and age policy that's age sensitive. I do think you need policies around aging that would have to address all of these issues. But there's a lot of work also to be done with the private sector, right? I think the partnership with the private sector, increasingly they going to be, if not or very close to already being the largest employer in the region. It's going to get to that point. That's engagement with um, the companies to make sure that they are able to have um, pension schemes, investment schemes that are taking into account the aging of their workforce, right? And then finally, I think it is, even though this may not be strictly policy, but I think it is important to have people aware of their rights and what is going to happen to them, right? This is where the advocacy that we mentioned earlier becomes very important. You can have all the policies and laws in the world. At the end of the day, if you know your rights, if you're vigilant as an employee, you look at that pay slip, and you query if you don't see a deduction for social security. And again, it's not only social security. You have to look at other ways of protecting yourself from income insecurity when you get older outside of the NIS. This is where the savvy investors like Marilyn, right, can then advise people who are younger, right, to start really taking seriously and not wait until you are 40 or 50 to start thinking about retirement. Yeah. So so that's basically what I would recommend is policies in a variety of areas: poverty, aging, health, all of these things interlink and should be designed in a way that's responsive to the needs of older people.
Okay, we have a question and a comment. So the question is, given that pension systems are historically designed around male-dominated continuous full-time employment patterns, how can we restructure them to account for the unpaid and underpaid care work that disproportionately falls on women without simply reinforcing the expectation that women should bear the brunt of caregiving? And do you think current policy discussions on pension reform genuinely challenge patriarchal economic structures, or are they just surface level adjustments?
Okay, so I do think in my presentation I gave some recommendations, yeah, around this, but I totally understand if it was missed because this is also a new area for me as well as I was preparing for this. I had recommended that we compensate for time dedicated to unpaid care work, right? And there are measures that you can put in place for this. And there are countries around the world, not only in Western countries, but even in Latin America and Uruguay and so on, where benefits are designed to take into account the fact that people would have done unpaid care work throughout their life, and then that's estimated and included in the benefit, right, that they get upon retirement. There is also the option of the indexing, the cost of living indexing, which may not always account for the unpaid care work, but if you adjust the benefit to cost of living and you got $100 in 2010, you should not be getting $100 in 2050, right? Because the cost of living, all of these measures that you can put in place to be able to account for underemployment, part-time employment, but also unpaid care work. I also mentioned that the motherhood penalty, there's a thing called the motherhood penalty, which is linked to the unpaid care work, right? Where essentially we are sanctioning women for reproducing the next generation, and we are surprised when they decide that they don't want to have any kids because later on, where we have maternity leave, but then there may be some employers when you come back into the labor market, you see kind of disruptions in women's employment labor patterns because they were doing unpaid care work, taking care of infants and children. If you can remove that penalty by introducing parental leave, right? So then the employer is the issue of bias in employing people, bringing them back into the labor market after maternity and so on, or disability or whatever. That's, well, let me speak to the maternity issue because that is related to unpaid care work. If you remove that penalty, because it's no longer just a woman's motherhood penalty, it is now men are required to step out to help take care of the children. You see, so the sanction is kind of in Barbados not totally equalized because women get about the 14 weeks and the men get a month or 3 weeks. I think it's 3 weeks. I would like to see it where everybody is sanctioned, quote unquote, right? So you are doing the unpaid care work, and that removes the penalty, quote unquote. And that also does something culturally. It sends a message that caring is not only the domain of women, it's also the domain of men. And finally, I didn't mention this in my presentation, but Barbados is one of the few jurisdictions in the Caribbean that has a subsidized child care system. It's called the nursery, the government nursery, which a lot of citizens tend to take for granted. That doesn't exist in many places around the world. And so that has implications as well for income security because workers are able, for those who are able to access it, it's oversubscribed. They are able to get affordable access to childcare. So instead of paying $1,000 to a private daycare, you pay $20 Barbados a week. That's more money in your pocket, right? We take that for granted. And so I think measures like this have an impact on your retirement because you're able to invest in your retirement if you have money to do that. You're able to save money. Instead of paying $1,000, you pay, I think it's $20 per week. How can we then expand that service? I know the government's coffers are not unlimited, right? But these are the discussions that we need to have. So I hope I answered that question, because these are measures to address what you call the patriarchal case, Miss Kate Smith, the patriarchal economic structures, right? And Barbados has done, with the introduction of paternity leave, with the provision, even though it is oversubscribed, of unpaid, of subsidized childcare, the nursery program, with universal health care, with the non-contributory pension. These are measures that the government has taken, which many countries have not taken, including some developed countries have not taken. The question is, how do we then preserve these gains? We don't realize that they are measures that actually counter patriarchal economic structures. They are. Imagine if Barbados didn't have this, if we didn't have universal health, if we didn't have the subsidized childcare, if we didn't have the non-contributory pensions, we would have even a more patriarchal economic structure. So the question is, how can we expand these benefits, understanding that we have limited fiscal space as a small island, developing state. We are not Norway. So then the question is, do we want more taxes? I don't think so. Or, so we have some difficult decisions to make. But one recommendation I would give is to preserve the gains that we have made, and don't allow anybody to remove the benefits that we already have, which are quite progressive when compared to other CARICOM member states. Yes, so it's a question of preserving what we have and see how we can expand those benefits wider.
All right,
So
we
I
have
think
a,
that's that
have a
one.
comment. Thank you for
Yeah.
this presentation. The non-contributory pension has been under sustained attack by successive governments for decades, but the great wisdom behind this was often unspoken, a recognition of women's unpaid work. I think of my great aunt who never worked a day of her 86 years of her life, but without whom my brother and I could never become the men we became, thanks to her work while our parents went off to jobs. Non-contributory is perhaps the problematic term. My great aunt's contribution to her home was frankly priceless and cannot ever really be quantified. This, to me, is the greatest gender disparity in the social security system, but I fear the situation will not improve in recognizing the value of women's unpaid work in the era of neoliberal economics. And that was a comment. And we have another comment. Thanks.
Sorry, I'm not hearing you clearly. I don't know if anyone else is having the same
I said,
issue.
so oh, I'm sorry. Did you, I read the comment. Did you hear it?
Yes, and then
Okay,
yes,
and
so
then
you can.
we have thank you for your very informative session. So those are the two comments that we have. So how do you move forward from here now? How do you continue your research? Can you give us some idea what are your next steps as far as research is concerned? I'm just going to turn off my camera for a minute, but I can hear you loud and clear.
No problem. So, UN Women doesn't do a lot of work in pension, areas. That's our sister agency, ILO, does a lot of that. But I do think um, what we can do is to place more of a focus on gender and aging as an agency, globally, given the demographic crisis that we are facing. I think we do need to be more explicit, vocal, and I like what was mentioned about the fact that we call a non-contributory pension, even we shouldn't call the contribution, the beneficiaries of that pension scheme did work. They did contribute to the society. You mentioned your aunt, but anyway, I digress. I think to answer your question, Dale, I do think that in our work, at least UN Women's work on social protection, we need to pay more attention to issues around aging. I think the UN system needs to do more of that in the region. And I also think that more research needs to be done. It doesn't necessarily have to be done by UN Women. given the fact that we're an aging society, we need to do more research around things like the NIS, like do more gender analysis of that, of the data, right? That's coming out of the NIS. Encourage government to do more of those surveys of living conditions, because even though those surveys of living conditions are about poverty, but they cover the entire age spectrum. BARC and other stakeholders with a similar interest would be interested, in fact, should be at the table when the next poverty, if they haven't already consulted you, they should. They need to consult BARC in the design of the next survey of living conditions, because you have a vested interest. Your membership has a vested interest in understanding what the poverty status is of men and women who are retired 60 plus over, and so you should be at the table, because I know that at least civil society or other organizations are at the table when they're designing some of these research undertakings. And then finally, I think one of the things that we can do, and it's not necessarily in the research, is just to have more conversations like this, right? The power of a conversation like this sometimes is immeasurable, where we just share information, we have discussion, may not be research, right? But we are able to learn from each other. So I would even go further to say maybe not even research, but opportunities for dialogue and for learning and for exchange, I think are profound. You know, the sky is our limit there. And I do hope we're able to, you know, and have more of these kind of engagements.
Okay, we're coming up to the last few minutes of our Zoom call. And I just want for you to emphasize, and again, I say, I know you have touched on these things in your presentation and even when you were answering the questions, but I want you to leave with those on the call the importance of not only this kind of research, but having these kinds of services that you said are not even available in some developed countries, how important it is to the development of our country and to the sustainability of our people to have these kinds of services, and what each person can do. Because you mentioned what UN Women can do, you mentioned what BARC can do, and you did mention what people can do on an individual basis. But on a collective basis, when you bring all of these things together, how important is it? And what is it we can do? How do we start where we are?
Dale, thank you so much for that. I do think we need to preserve the gains we have made as a people and not allow the rug to be pulled out from under us. And I think one way we can do this is to have, you know, uh, have increased vigilance over some of these programs and policies as a matter of course. Um, it should be that anything to do with, obviously the NIS is in everybody's mind, right? The discussions there are unending. But you see, I made the link to the universal healthcare system, which may on the surface may not even seem to be like, if you talk to the lay person, they may think, what has this got to do with aging? Well, imagine what the society will be without the polyclinic. Who goes to the polyclinics? If you go to your polyclinic, I'm sure you're going to see a lot of older people. What will happen to those older people if they didn't have the polyclinics? As much as we complain about the long lines and QEH and so on, right? That has poverty implications that will result in income insecurity in ways that we can't even imagine, right? If we didn't have that service. That's an issue of concern for older people and for older women who tend to have more health-seeking behaviors and more ailments as they age as well, right? I also think we need to look at, again, on the surface, may not appear to be an issue that is for the elderly, or, you know, we've been talking about unpaid care work throughout, right? But things like disability, things like preserving the subsidized childcare that I mentioned, elder care. I did not even mention the National Assistance Board and the work that is done there, the visits to older people. Imagine if we didn't have that. That is paid for by by taxes. It's your money. You pay the taxes. It's not it may be free or subsidized at the point of service delivery, but it's not free. It's paid for by taxpayers, right? Imagine if we did not have the National Assistance Board, which many Bajans take for granted and which does not exist in many countries, including some developed countries, the economies. So I would encourage Barbadians to really, and BARP members, others, to really have a look at the protections that we have in this society, which are universal, and they should be universal because the consequence we will pay for that child not having access to universal education, free education, the consequence of not having a universal healthcare system, the consequence of not having a National Assistance Board program that services the elderly and persons with disabilities, the consequence of not having a non-contributory pension will mean severe poverty at the end of life, right? So I would say and I use the word the life course, we have to look at a life course, kind of have that as our vision for our society, and that we are all in this together. What impacts us at the end of life, the implications of not having these things at the beginning of life and throughout your working life will have an implication at the end of life, right? So this is why the word universal becomes very important, because it's literally all of us. I will end by saying that the temptation is there when we have the fiscal state argument to say, well, you see, we don't have any money because of all these universal things. You need to pay at the polyclinic. You need to remove the free education thing. You need to, focus, as I was saying, I had some conversations with some colleagues from Eastern Caribbean, remove the non-contributory pension. The NIS should just be for people who contribute and so on. I don't think we want to live in that kind of society. We are a progressive society. We should preserve the gains that we have made, and we should continue preserving the universality of our rights and the universality of our programs that cover us with that provide us with protection, from the beginning of life to the end of life. So I'll end with that, and I really do want to use this opportunity again to thank Barb for inviting me to this. It has really been an immense pleasure. And when I was doing some of the research, I said, you need to practice what you preach.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Iyahen, but I'm going to let the official thank you come from our Chief Executive Officer, Steve Allen. Good evening, CEO.
Good evening. You can hear me, Dale?
Yes, I can. Go ahead.
Okay, good evening. Protocol being established. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for taking the time to sit in on our Zoom call. A special thank to you, our presenter, for sharing your knowledge with us and opening our eyes to the deeper efforts of the pay gap between men and women, especially at retirement. More than giving us food for thought, it has given us some action points which we can form as part of our advocacy as we try to continue to advocate for our seniors, no matter their gender or income, but we wanted to be able to live with comfort and with dignity. I'd like to thank our officers, members of the board, and staff, led by our event coordinator, Sherilyn Best, who put this session together. Very well done. Thank you again, and on behalf of Bart, we wish you a restful night. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, CEO. And it's just left for me to, of course, extend my thank you to everybody who came on the call. I thought we had a very good, robust discussion. It also gave me some things to ponder as well. And I hope our 40 to 59-year-olds who are on the call, it will give them some things to ponder too, and some action to take as they approach retirement. Thank you, Ms. Iyahen. And of course, thank you to Sharon Carter, both of them from UN Women, and our president, and of course, all our members of staff and the members of our board. So it's just left for me to tell you good night and have a restful sleep, as the CEO said, and a safe, happy, and productive day tomorrow. Good night.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful night, everyone.